Welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is session 6 of the webinar series, How to Plan, Produce and Deploy a PIV-enabled PACS. This is produced by the Secure Technology Alliance, Educational Institute and Access Control Council. Today's session is the last installment of the series, and it is called Lessons Learned. My name is Lars Sunderborn, Director of Training Programs for the Secure Technology Alliance. Before joining the Secure Technology Alliance, I worked with US, Canadian, and British security agencies worldwide. I'm a former chair of the Access Control Council. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for download from our website, and that will include all the slides and the audio. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please submit those questions using the text tool that is at the bottom of the dashboard. We will answer those as they come along, and we also have the question and answer session at the end. Let me introduce the rest of the speakers. We are pleased to have with us here some of our industry thought leaders. We have Mike Kelly, who is the Principal Electronic System Engineer and Technical Specialist for Parsons Corporation. We also have William Bill Windsor, IT Program Manager at the Department of Homeland Security. We have Tony Damalas. Tony is responsible for the Identity, Credentialing, and Access Management Solutions divisions of Signet Technologies and serves as a subject matter expert for all FICAM opportunities. Signet is a convergent technologies company and a system integrator. We have Mark Steffler, who is the VP of Government Practice at Quantum Secure. Quantum Secure is an HID global company. We have Stafford Mahfouz, who is the Manager, Government and DoD Programs at Johnson Control Federal Systems and is a premium access control system manufacturer. And we have Daryl Hendricks, who is the Deputy Program Manager, IT Specialist at GSA. Welcome everybody, and thank you for your participation. So who is the Secure Technology Alliance? We are a Secure Technology Alliance, a non-for-profit multi-industry association. We work to stimulate the understanding, adoption, and widespread application of secure solutions. We provide, in a collaborative, member-driven environment, education and information on how smart card, embedded chip technology, and related hardware and software can be adopted across all markets in the United States. Our focus are access control, authentication, healthcare applications, identity management applications, Internet of Things, mobile devices, payment, and transportation. And what we do for these industries are bring together stakeholders to effectively collaborate on promoting secure technology solutions and addressing industry challenges. We publish white papers, we produce webinars such as this, workshops, newsletters, position papers, and web content. We create conferences and events that focus on specific markets and technology for those markets, offer education programs, training, and industry certifications. We provide networking opportunities for professionals to share ideas and knowledge, and we produce strong industry communications throughout the public relations, web reputations, and social media. The Access Control Council focuses on accelerating the widespread acceptance, use, and applications of secure technologies in various form factors for physical and logical access control. The group brings together in an open forum leading users and technologies from both the public and private sectors. We have produced some examples of white papers that are available from our website. A few examples there are commercial identity verification, CIV credential that leverage FIPS 201 and PIV card standards. We produced a comparison of PIV, PIV-I, and CIV credentials, a guide specification for architects and engineers for smart card-based PACS cards and readers from non-government PACS, strong authentication using smart card technology for logical access, and we support the PIV application in mobile devices with the UICC. The National Center for Advanced Payment and Identity Security That is where we have the Educational Institute and the National Center for Advanced Payment and Identity Security in Crystal City. That is the Educational Institute is residing there, and that's where I spend most of my time. The certifications that are available is CSCIP, that stands for Certified Smart Card Industry Professional, and it is a broad range generic smart card certification. We have a similar program that is focused on payments in the payment industries, and that is the CSCIP-P. Audience there and certificates include credit card issuers, payment terminal manufacturers, payment processing companies, and payment network providers, to name a few. It's a global audience for this one. CSCIP-G for government, that's focused on US-specific topics for PIV, PIV-I, and DoD CAC cards. CSEIP, that is a 3-day certification that supports the GSA evaluation program. One leg of the evaluation program certifies product. This one certifies people. A growing number of agencies requires the CSCIP certification for companies and people to qualify to even bid on PACS projects. This is the 6th session of our 6-session webinar series. Session 1, that dealt with introducing what we're going to do. Session 2, that established facility characteristics. That means that we then established the threat and risk assessment. Session number 3, that was a project scope. Session number 4, that dealt with procurement strategies. Session number 5, that dealt with deployment. And session number 6, that is the last one of our series, deals with lessons learned. And lessons learned are divided into policies and operation and implementation and procurement. So today we're going to start off here with policies. And all of these changes, significant changes on the equipment, how does a large agency face the challenges, and what challenges do they face when they try to implement a FICAM compliant PAC system? And we have Bill Windsor that represents a large agency here. And Bill, how do your agency reply to these and respond to these?
So I think the challenges we face really is education and funding. It's extremely important, as we mentioned in previous webinars, is educating our C-suite members, our chief of information, our chief of finance, our chief security officer, and our chief of procurement, making sure they understand what needs to be done, what requirements we have when it comes to FICAM and physical access, and how we go about getting these systems. And as I mentioned, funding. Funding's always a jackpot for most agencies. It is generally a major uphill battle, often requiring 2 or more years to do the pre-planning to get the adequate amount of money needed to affect these changes.
So you represent an agency a very large agency with multiple component agencies in it. How do you think other large agencies react and affect these changes?
Well, I think the big thing that needs to be done to really embrace this as it needs to be seen today is looking at it from the aspect of it being an IT activity. PAC systems are IT systems as deemed by OMB's A130 update last year. It's still a somewhat new idea. Again, education is critical in this. Helping those CXO types understand that these PAC systems do use servers. They use operating systems just like any other traditional software-based system, and that the fact that they use data that it's identical to other systems that they're familiar with, often SQL type data. The other portion of this is having leadership on your side. That education goes much further beyond just the understanding. By having them singing the praises, if you will, you get that organizational support. Also, it's important to recognize that your CSO has that same equal role as your CIO. The primary difference that we see today, though, is there's no federal CSO. So one of the challenges we do face there is we don't really have a collaborated direction from OMB for CSO. So we're kind of having to work across agencies to solve some of that as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what is interesting here is that PACS is moving from security to IT. And Stafford, as a PACS manufacturer, we have talked about some procurements, but if a scope of work follows a traditional or follows for a compliant PACS, but the customer would like to go with a traditional or have a traditional, what do you do to implement the implement of a PACS to be compliant with FIPS 201?
Well, Lars, it is a challenge, but reinforcing and educating the end users from the standpoint of what the mandates cover, especially from the PACS perspective, and reinforcing the fact that you can no longer deploy a system that's just based on a reader. Just because a reader can read a PIV card doesn't mean it's a compliant system, and that was kind of the mentality in the early, in the early goings of things. But continuing to educate the end users, and also not only the security professionals, but also from an IT perspective as a follow-on to Bill's comments, assuring that that you understand what the risks that have to be mitigated for deploying a system, because some of the reluctance is that some systems haven't been migrated or put onto an agency's network. There's some that do. There are others that have a closed network, and being able to assure that all the components to be deployed can operate and function in order to fulfill the requirement.
Yeah, thank you, Stafford. And I heard you mention that in the early days it was good enough to have a reader that can read some data after this. Well, that has certainly changed. We now need to have certificate and certificate validation. And for Daryl, when an agency needs to incorporate these, do they need to incorporate public key technologies within the electronic access control system? How do you procure that?
Yes, Lars. Federal agencies are required to incorporate public key technology within their electronic physical access systems. All of these PACS systems are now required to be fully FIPS 201 compliant. So that means that the new federal EPAC systems must have the capability to use public key infrastructure to validate X.509 certificates as part of a federal facility access control system. Although physical access controls are set via risk and vulnerability assessments, the systems will need the capability of meeting all levels of assurance stated in this special publication 800-116.
Okay. So we're going to move in a little bit to the operation and implementation. And Mike, who represents a system integrator, what issues do you need to consider when you choose an authentication mechanism for an access control point?
Well, HSPD 12 says FIPS 201 has to include graduated criteria to give you some flexibility in selecting your appropriate level of security. So that means the first and most important item you need to consider is risk. The Interagency Security Committee guidelines in this special publication 816, we've talked about both of those in earlier sessions, give some of the best guidance in that regard. One thing I'd point out is don't forget the impact that higher levels of assurance have on throughput. If you need to authenticate PIV card holders from other agencies, you're going to want to limit the selections to mechanisms that only use mandatory buffers on the card. The optional buffers haven't been adopted by every issuer. Cards also have a 2 to 3 year lifespan. Even though a buffer may be mandatory today, you still may find it won't be available on older cards if that buffer was originally an optional container on the card. Finally, know how you're going to handle some of the use cases, the less standard use cases, for example, non-PIV eligible personnel, PIV and non-PIV visitors, and people who have lost or forgotten their cards.
Yeah, I heard you mention here throughputs and so on. And Bill, from an agency end user perspective and viewpoint, what are some of the operational differences that agencies face in the day-to-day operation of PACS?
So DHS, we've seen a number of differences across the products on how the enrollment itself takes place. Differences in cards as they're represented by our visitors, and routine practices that the different components of DHS have taken up and performing access management. So we're addressing each of these areas. We're looking at the enrollment side of things to try and determine, is there a means to create a standard for enrollment? So it's an any PACS kind of an equation. That would also include the inclusion, of the PIV authentication certificate and the card authentication certificates for our non-PIV users. Obviously, there's a gamut of non-PIV credentials that we're faced to use every day. We still have to rely on our manual processes. I think this is going to be a burden for us for a while. I imagine that will be the same for a number of agencies. The real challenge in that is there's really no means there to authenticate that credential or that represented identity at the time of a visit. Last but not least is the routine processes. We're looking at this from trying to normalize how we handle our employees, our contractors, all of our visitors, to include internal and external visitors. We want to make sure that when someone comes to DHS that the practice is somewhat equal across the department.
It sounds like a fairly significant change. And Mike, from a system integration standpoint here, you certainly encounter things that work really well and some things that needs to be fixed. What are some of the most common issues that you see end users encounter when they first use the PIV for physical access control?
Well, early on, we saw quite a few contactless antenna failures. People were using the contactless interface of the card for logical access, but they never used the contactless interface. First time they tried at a PACS reader, the card wouldn't work, so there were a lot of cards that had to be reissued. The problem isn't as big as it used to be, but you should make sure all the cards function correctly before you go live. Proper card presentation can also be an issue for new users. They need to get used to holding the card half an inch or so from the face of the reader, and they need to hold it still through the entire read cycle. That's a lot longer than it was with older technology cards. You want to make sure you communicate this to your users early and often in as many different ways as possible. This is a chance to get creative. I've seen people use posters, email, websites, newsletters. You may also want to install test readers at enrollment locations before you go live so users can test their cards and learn how to use the card properly.
That's good lessons learned approaches there. And on this subject, I do recall early on there was some similar issues here, and the Access Control Council wrote a short recommendation for Department of Defense. We made it into an access control project, and it was called PIV performance, PIV card performance, and such. That paper became mandatory reading for all DoD employees, and it is still available for download on the Secure Technology Alliance website. Tony, you represent also a large system integrator, and when it comes to here to enrollment, what do you think are different from the different PACS and validation authentication?
Well, we have to leverage the data elements that are on the card in order to bring them into the PACS. We call that provisioning in order to perform the validation and authentication that is a requirement in a FICAM PACS. Validation and authentication are achieved using digital encryption keys. I'd like to emphasize here, by the way, that the use of digital cryptography is a fundamental and critical differentiator of a FICAM PACS from a traditional or legacy PACS and is a paradigm shift in the access control systems industry. There are 4 digital keys associated with a PIV card, of which 2 are used by the PACS for validation and authentication. They are the CAKE, spelled C-A-K, and the PIV-auth key, or PIV authentication key. The CAKE, or card authentication key, is the only digital key that can be used in a contactless operation. It assures the PIV card is authentic. It represents only something you have, thus providing a single factor of authentication. The PIV authentication key is the second key available to the PACS and can only be obtained by inserting the card into the reader for contact operation, plus entering a PIN, which is sent to the card, not to the PACS, I might add. This will unlock the PIV-auth container to allow use of the key to perform authentication. The use of the PIN number, something you know, and it adds to something you have, which is the PIV card, and this is what makes it a two-factor authentication process. Another key requirement for a FICAM PACS is that the identity associated with the credential be validated before it is provisioned into the PACS. That is, has it been revoked? When checking the revocation status of the identity, you are performing identity validation, and it is the PIV-auth key that is used to verify this by checking to see if this digital key has been revoked. So therefore, cards are authenticated and identities are validated. And these 2 digital keys, the CAKE and the PIV-auth, are used for these purposes and are contained in the credential. So performing validation and authentication represents the core functions of a FICAM PACS and are performed with this data from the card. These fundamental elements are key to an enrollment process, and then subsequently to use at the door when authenticating to the reader and validating periodically.
Right, that's a lot of certificates and a lot of keys on these cards, and it's quite a process to get these things registered. Bill, from an agency end user, what effects have you recognized? What do you think is being recognized by federal agencies when they attempt to accept all PIV and DoD CAC cards?
Well, first thing I'll say is not all PIV cards are alike. I think those of us that have tried to use them on a regular routine basis, and to the point some of the integrators are making, all these cards are not issued the same, although the executive branch agencies should be issuing these PIV cards based on standards, interoperable standards no less. We're finding sometimes minor differences in how the card gets how it communicates to the PACS. There are subtle differences in how the readers perform that communication. Some of the content that's being placed in the card is often different, where they may not be fully acclimated with those certificates that Tony just spoke to. And other little tiny issues with just the way they manage the cards themselves. So again, not all cards are equal, and then sometimes that does represent challenges. Often we try to communicate with our components and our PACS operations. If they see cards like a CAC card as an example, often you'll run into that challenge of not having that card authentication key. So you kind of know what to expect in advance of it.
Thank you, Bill. Tony, you spoke to the registration, and if there's no CAKE on the DoD CAC card or other contactless mechanism available for this, how do you deal with registering those cards?
Well, Lars, for access control applications, the 2 certificates available are the PIV-auth and the CAKE, as I described earlier. With no CAKE, you are left with the PIV-auth key, which is released for use after the card is inserted into the contact portion of the reader, followed by the PIN entry to the card. Of course, this is not contactless and consequently does not qualify as a contactless mechanism. So without the CAKE, you're left with no other compliant method that is contactless.
But you mentioned also earlier, Tony, here that it was easy to be compliant in the early days. Could you use the Chewit as a contactless element for authentication?
Chewit authentication involves the Chewit and its digital signature element in a free read mode, that is, without a PIN entry, and either with a contactless or contact interface. It is a legacy method and now deprecated, and therefore no longer a compliant means for authentication. It would be considered a contactless method, but not a compliant one. However, it can serve as part of a migration strategy to get you moving toward full compliant end state, with the subsequent disabling of that method, of course.
Okay. Thank you, Tony. And Stafford, as a system manufacturer, you provide some guidance to agencies, and they certainly needs to have that guidance. How do you go about convincing those people to accept providing compliant interoperable visitor and temporary cards for use in PACS?
Well, Lars, it's an ongoing education, again, the educational process, and again, spelling out what the components that are required in order to fulfill the requirements, and assuring that when the statement of work comes out, and typically what happens is the statement of work will call out for a fully compliant system, but either due to perhaps some budget constraints that weren't fulfilled from a funding perspective or whatever, a reluctance to move forward with, for example, putting the certificate management service or server onto, connecting it to the world to be able to check the Federal Bridge, and working with the IT professionals from a risk mitigation perspective to assure that the system can perform what it needs to do in order to do the ongoing validation. You really have to continue to stay focused and provide the information needed so that the IT professionals can move forward with mitigating whatever risk they need to from a security controls perspective, for example. And while you can do an implementation from a baby steps standpoint, you still have to assure that all the elements of the PACS system are in place in order to ultimately fulfill the requirements. Right.
And the requirements are to have the PIV or PIV-I, but there are short contractors and contingent workers and visitors who need some level of physical access. And Mark, you have been involved with this issue for some time and have a good solution. You don't want to issue expensive PIV cards to the people today. Understand that prox cards are deprecated. So how do you support those populations that are not going to have a PIV card?
Yeah, thanks, Lars. I think this is an area where, in my opinion, when they were thinking about FIPS 201 and having PIV and then PIV-I cards and who gets those cards, there's always been this gap, which is PIV cards, of course, issued to people needing access for 6 months or greater, and those are only issued by the government. And then PIV-I cards can be issued both by corporations and by the government, and the government can choose to trust a PIV-I card at some level. And so once you swap out, this whole webinar series is all about, making sure that you have a PACS system which can properly authenticate and use a PIV card or a PIV-I card. So what happens now is you have a bunch of people in government who don't have PIV or PIV-I cards. These are visitors, and these are contingent workers. These are contract workers. These are people who are going to do a job, an important job, fixing your HVAC or redoing your electrical closets and so forth, that might be there for 2, 3, 4 weeks, a couple of months, but they're not going to get a PIV card. So the question is, you got all this infrastructure you've upgraded to only read PIV cards, and you've deprecated these prox cards, and you can't even use prox cards anymore at the door, which is the way it should be. So what do you do about these guys? You need to offer them some means to get where they need to go to get their job done, and these people. So that's leaving this big gap, and that is a real problem. So a lot of agencies have still used these prox cards, even though they're deprecated, these facility access cards. And the hole in the market has been that in order for an organization, a government organization, to issue some type of a smart card that's compatible, like with a PIV-I, they have to put a whole, card management infrastructure in and issue certificates and possibly even personalize these cards. And that is extremely expensive for one-time use for a couple of weeks. So the gap now has been filled with a new class of cards that have come on the market, temporary access cards, that are pre-provisioned with both the PIV-off type certificate. I'm not going to say it's a PIV-off because it's a type of it, and a cake type certificate, so a contactless and contact certificates that can be read and interoperate with this PIV-enabled PACS. That's the key thing. And so the thing for government agency personnel who here on the webinar to keep in mind is, SP 800-116, and also this new rewrite of the OMB M18 dash whatever it's going to be. They are very clear on the fact that you need to be able to use PIV-I and a card which is compatible with those type of cards, and not use these proxy cards, because they just opens up the door for huge risk problems. So there are COTS products out there that can deliver a card, and the idea would be that you have some kind of a system that would provision that card to a particular visitor or particular contractor, and when that contractor or visitor is done with their visit or their contract, they would return the card, let's say after 3 weeks, goes back in a box, and then the next visitor or the next contractor comes up, the system can assign that same card to a different identity, a different person. They can use it for different doors, whatever the authorization may be, and put it back in the box. So a reusable temporary access card solves this problem, and these cards are coming on the market, and that is, in my mind, a terrific way to close the gap, and something that really wasn't thought through very well in thinking about, what do you do with these 6 months or less people. So that's a great solution, and I think that's something that all the government agencies should pay attention to.
Well, that sounds like a good application for the CIV, and have a local trust root anchor in the system. That would avoid having to go to external authentication and validation. And Mike, I know that you're working a lot with the different DoD components here. What are some of the issues you've encountered when you install access control system for an area that is isolated, such as perhaps a SCIF?
Well, Lars, the first thing you have to realize is that access control isn't even allowed for a SCIF if it's not unoccupied. The mechanical combination locks have to be used. A lot of times you'll see both electronic access control being used as a day gate when the SCIF's occupied, and then a mechanical lock and intrusion detection protecting the SCIF when it's not being used. The technical specification for Intelligence Community Directive 705 is what you need to use when you're going to install electronic access control. The access control requirements are in Chapter 8. At a high level, the manufacturers have to certify false accept and false reject probability in writing. Any equipment outside the SCIF has to be securely fastened and tampered. Communication to equipment outside the SCIF must be AES encrypted, and the software has to be installed either in the SCIF or another secret controlled area. If electronic processing is done in the SCIF, metallic penetrations that leave the SCIF may need special grounding or bonding, or you may need to apply other tempest countermeasures like dielectric brakes. So it's important you coordinate with both the authorizing official and the certified tempest technical authority early in the design process to make sure you address all the requirements.
Yeah, it could be quite a bit, and the ATO and that other requirement could take quite some time to achieve. So having that started right from the beginning is a good recommendation. Tony, do you, as a system integrator, see that it is a firm requirement to have an external or internet connection to have a FICAM compliant PAX?
To be fully compliant, yes. But if there is no internet connection, however, the external connection can be a direct connection to the agency certificate status responder, which may be on their network, or should be on their intranet, I should say. If that is preferred, then that will work. In either case, the objective is to perform identity validation checks, and this cannot be done within the PAX alone. Now, if you are also processing visitors from other agencies, then an internet connection cannot be avoided because these visitors would not be included in the agency's certificate status responder database, and thus reliance on the federal PKI bridge is the only option.
Okay. Thank you. So Stafford, from when you are talking to your customers and you're promoting your equipment, how do you manage to convince IT to allow certificate management server on the internet? There's been some pushbacks on that.
Well, there has, and it's just, again, because it takes coordination with the IT folks from the standpoint of assuring that whatever port usage and protocols, and essentially going through the information assurance testing process. If that server is going to need to get out to the internet, and to Tony's point, we've had some customers that have decided to, where they use a proxy server, for example, that actually goes out, that's protected and secured and locked down, and is able to utilize the security rules that were put in place for that server, and then it can talk back to essentially the PACS system, so that it can do what it needs to do the challenge response on the PIV or PIV-I cards.
Okay, so you need to go through a firewall with that. Did I understand you right? When I heard you say a proxy server that might be located on the outside, and then you punch through the firewall and connect to your internal PACS?
Correct. So essentially, the customer has mitigated and implemented its own server, if you will, to go out, get outside, and then everything is set up and configured so that it can talk back to the PACS system back through their firewall.
That might be one lesson that could be useful for various agencies. However, agencies usually don't like to discuss what they're doing for their IT security, so it might be an approach that could be useful for others. And Mark, we currently manage PACS on their own segregated security network, and they don't require an ATO. So there's been a lot of discussion that PACS are now IT systems, and they need access to the federal bridge, which is what we've heard both Tony and Stafford and Mike and Mark talk about here earlier. What are some things you can do to make people more comfortable with having a PACS available on the internet?
Right. This could itself be a 30-minute discussion, and I think Tony absolutely nailed it. In the end, just to really meet the GSA APL intent, which is to be able to validate a card at time of use, the only way you can do that up to the minute, so to speak, is to have some kind of connection from the PACS or through middleware to the authoritative source, or some way to get the then current information to know whether that card is useful at the time of presentation on the PACS. So it's inevitable that there's got to be that kind of up-to-date information, and that's only ultimately going to come over the internet, because while you can cache all your cards in your enterprise, like let's say you're in a component of DHS, you might have all your cards cached there. What about another component of DHS that comes and visits you and wants to enroll their card and use it? You still have to get outside and validate it. So here's the thing. First of all, this was foreseen for years now by the federal government, the federal enterprise, the CIO Council. The Circular A130 was rewritten almost 2 years ago now, and it was stated in there very clearly that these PACS systems are IT systems, and they are subject to all of the oversight, the FISMA controls, et cetera, that any other IT system is going to be exposed to. So that certainly makes it incumbent upon the PACS software guys to make sure that their systems can be approved, can achieve an ATO, authority to operate, and meet all the FISMA controls and so forth. So bottom line is the PACS systems are IT systems. The government says so. Everybody knows it. And furthermore, the idea about protecting personal identifiable information in PACS is also a very powerful issue for the government to deal with. In many cases in the past, PACS people managing PACS have put all kinds of PII well beyond a picture and a first name and last name. It could be driver's license numbers, social security numbers, dates of birth, whatever, into the PACS, and these things should not be in the PACS. So there's a whole really mind shift that needs to happen. And in my opinion, what needs to really happen here is the IT departments and the CSOs, the traditional facility security people who manage the physical security, have to get together organizationally and get together and work together in order to bring these PACS onto the enterprise network so they can get access to a TIC, a trusted internet connection that all government agencies have, and to make sure that they can get the validation of the data, the PIV data and so forth through the internet. So that's the big part of it right there. And then really, if you read the FICAM, there's really no way to do this again in FICAM without bringing these packs from their stovepipe networks into the enterprise network, so they can be managed on the enterprise network and reported on. So everything that we've been seeing in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years has pointed that the paradigm needs to change, that the physical access control departments need to embrace the idea of having the packs on the enterprise network or easily accessible from the enterprise networks, so that they can achieve all the other government requirements like the APL and so forth. So this is inevitable, and in my opinion, I would just urge all the CSOs to reach out to the CISO in order to better understand what the implications are with this and make it happen. So in my opinion, there's no choice but for the facility security departments to embrace this this requirement and move forward in collaboration with the CISOs.
Sounds like another takeaway lesson from this is to identify early in the program, identify all the different departments and their stakeholders, and get them together and on the same page.
And I might just add one last thing real quick, Lars, is that, this M18 memo talks about this very thing, governance, and having a standing committee within your organization to do these things. So I would just urge everyone to read that as well as that memo gets published. Sorry to interrupt.
I think so, and it highlights some of the issues that we have discussed here today and try to prevent them for future. So we talked a lot about registration and first use of a card here. And Tony, when you are setting up the systems here and helping your agency and users, can you manually enroll a PIV card from data on the card against some type of list that the customer may have?
Well, the data on the card is in 3 different types of identity objects classification. One is biometric, graphic, and digital encryption keys, all of which is data not readily or manually transferable other than through an electronic process. In short, the answer is no. You cannot manually enroll a PIV card and be compliant. The data on a FICAM PACS is such that it has to be put in from an authoritative source. And even if you had all the data readily available to you somehow, including the digital certificate keys, and you want to manually enter them into the database, the disqualifying factor is the human element. A human is not considered an authoritative source. It is a normative requirement that this data be acquired and provisioned into the PACS from an authoritative source. So again, in short, no.
Okay. Well, I kind of didn't think so, but thank you for clarification. Mike, is there anything that you think is unique to a PIV-enabled PACS that engineering people and the technicians should be considering when they're designing and installing a system?
Yeah, I think it falls under 2 ends. And the first one, because the cards are powered from the reader's field and they operate at a higher frequency. So the readers, the way they're installed, can have a significant impact on operations. For example, technicians need to minimize the amount of metal in the reader's field. They also need to make sure panels and the readers are properly grounded. That's more critical now than it was in the past. The readers may also have increased power requirements, so you may need larger power cable conductors and external power supplies. You can't rely solely on the panel's internal power supplies. On the other side, and we've already talked about some of this with some of Tony and Stafford's comments, you'll need to work with the network engineers to make sure ports, protocols, and services are configured properly so they support the external communication with the certificate authorities either directly or through an OCSP responder. And that goes back to the firewall configuration you mentioned earlier.
That's quite a bit of changes, quite a bit of changes. So, Stafford, how do you address an end user that wants to continue to use a legacy credential when you're talking to them and you're trying to convince them to go with a fully compliant system?
Well, Lars, we're all sensitive to, again, budgets that are available to begin to replace cards. At the end of the day, again, it's a continued effort to educate and state the facts that the legacy credentials have been deprecated, and they have to, as quickly as they can and as soon as they have budgets available, move to a PIV compliant credential. Secondly, they also have to assure that the reader technologies that are now being deployed today to meet these requirements, in some cases, will not support some of these legacy credentials. So it's one way or the other, they'll have to move forward with compliance. And, we, along with the integrators and other manufacturers, we all work together to assure that the systems that are being deployed fulfill those requirements. But, usually the customer understands that they have to, make that move. It's just, again, it's an education process.
Right. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. And when it comes to this, moving from legacy card and credentials to new, Mike, what options do you think an agency or one of your customers have when it comes to migrating an existing non-PIV packs to a compliant status?
Well, there's first thing you have to realize there's more than 20 approved PIV card issuers, and you won't be able to connect directly to their databases. Even if you could, you'd need a way to limit the information you pull so that you only get information for people who need access to your facility. You don't want the information for everyone who has a valid PIV card. There has to be a local registration process to get the information you need, and it needs to minimize the need for data or for manual data entry. So really the question is whether that new information from the local registration process should be associated with the existing PACS data. There's certainly benefits to that, linking the old to the new information. Still, though, it may not always be the best choice, especially for smaller facilities. You need to assess both the quantity and the quality of the existing PACS data. If you have a large number of active card holders and the PACS data is relatively accurate, you may be able to use database scripts to match PIV card and PACS attributes, such as the first name, last name, and date of birth. When a new record's found, you can create a new, when a record match, is found, you can create a new record for that person. You won't have to re-enter all the access privileges, and you can maintain each person's access history. It's not uncommon for a person or card record to appear in many different tables of a PACS database, so you want to work with someone experienced with your particular PACS, such as an integrator or even the manufacturer. You should also consider developing your scripts in a test environment. You'll probably need several iterations. Remember, your PACS data was manually entered, so the other option, especially if it has a lot of errors, you'll find orphaned records, especially in older systems. So these types of errors make it difficult to match attributes from PIV cards with PACS records. In this case, you'll be better off creating new identity and card records in the PACS. They can coexist with the legacy records during the migration, then the legacy records can be archived or deleted after the migration. This approach substantially increases the size of the database during migration, so you'll want to make sure the panels have enough memory to support that increased size.
That's a good migration strategy there, Mike. So that deals with card data and user record data. So Daryl, you serve just about every agency is a customer of yourself here. So if one of your agency customers have a non-PIV compliant PACS, can you leverage your current PACS infrastructure and investment?
Possibly, Lars. In some cases, all or some of the existing non-PIV compliant PACS infrastructure and investment can be leveraged. Agencies must review and analyze non-compliant systems to ensure that they can be upgraded to meet all the PIV guidance and standards. Unfortunately, I think most agencies will find that their existing systems cannot be upgraded in a cost-effective manner and will need to completely replace the system.
Okay. So, Bill, your agency, how do your agency buy PACS products?
So all executive branch agencies are required to use APL-approved products. It's not only listed in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, but it's also listed in the OMB mandates. Today, some agencies do not enforce those practices. DHS is sort of guilty of that. We're working to correct that by introducing some new processes to review those acquisitions going out the door and take a look at not only the practice of acquiring, but what's being purchased as well.
Okay, thank you. And Daryl, how can federal agencies procure fully compliant electronic system that they know is going to work?
Federal agencies have several contracting options available for PIV-compliant PAC systems. In short, agencies can procure through GSA's Federal Acquisition Service Schedule 84. They can leverage PACS contracts from other federal agencies, or they have the ability to procure their own PACS system through their own contract vehicles or awards. I would recommend that agencies review NIST Special Publication 800-116, the Identity, Credential, and Access Management PIV e-PACS document, and also the FAS Schedule 84 PACS Customer Ordering Guide as a technical starting point.
Okay, that was a good hint. Where may they find that PACS ordering guide and some of these specifications? Hello, Daryl. So where may people find ordering guides and things like that you just talked about?
Yeah, they can find those guides generally at the idmanagement.gov website. That's operated by GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy. And you can also find links at the gsa.gov website as well through our office.
Okay, thanks. And while I have you on here, how should PACS manufacturer engineer their offerings to comply with the federal PIV? I mean, GSA is part of, is who manages the evaluation program and the approved product list.
Correct. Manufacturers should ensure that their offerings fully comply with all federal PIV PACS requirements and assurance levels. For example, they simply can't offer a product that just reads card serial number and then parse it for a unique identifier within that serial number. To be fully compliant, systems must read and validate PIV authentication certificates, biometrics, card authentication keys, as was mentioned, and in some cases, the cardholder unique identifier. And only the systems that can perform all four validations can they be considered fully compliant.
Okay, yeah, and it's very deceiving because many people who are not intimately familiar with the technical processes here, it's so deceiving because people could think that they're compliant by holding up a PIV card to a reader. They get some data off the card that they can register in the system and open up the door. And for the uninitiated, it looks like everything is fine. We're compliant. Hey, look at this. We're using the PIV card in front of a reader. We can go through. Where in fact, they may only be reading the chip serial number of the card. So that is the evaluation program, I think, is a fantastic resource. Do you have any recommendation what manufacturers can do to pass the GSA evaluation? In fact, I just had a question from a member company this morning that is going to submit something to the GSA for the evaluation. Any advice that you can give manufacturers on how to pass this?
Absolutely. They should first go to the Office of Government-Wide Policy website. That's the idmanagement.gov website. It tells you how to apply for to get on their approved products list and how to work with the NIST standards. You can generally find a link to all those standards at that website. Start on with a technical approach, as with the customer agencies. Learn all you can about the standards, the different validation methods and components built in FIPS 201 and SP 800-116. And again, the best place to start is at the idmanagement.gov website.
Okay. We are a few minutes left, and I would encourage the audience to submit some questions. And while we're doing that, I'm going to do the summary here. Achieving compliance is being completed by use of an increasing number of COTS equipment that have passed strict conformance testing by GSA evaluation program, and live use services delivered by a growing number of certified system integrators, and that requires cooperation between IT, security, and facilities. Now we will have a question and answer. And at the last, I should also point out here, the last two slides of this have all the reference documents. I have one question in here. I think I'm going to direct this to Tony because you talked quite a bit here of legacy cards. Tony, can I use multi-technology cards and readers to leverage what I already have?
In a migration strategy approach, you can, but in a compliant approach, you cannot. Multi-technology cards basically dumb down or reduce the authentication category to no assurance, and as a consequence, will not pass the APL listing criteria. Just for clarification, multi-technology cards and readers are those that leverage different types of technology, such as readers that read the 125 kilohertz and the 13.56 for the PIV technology. And an approved FICAN PAX is to use only approved PIV readers, listed on the APL, in conjunction with the co-submitted PAX and validation session is submitted as a package. These are the approved readers that can perform the various authentication methods discussed, on this webinar. Legacy technology cannot perform the approved authentication methods, and therefore using legacy technology on PIV readers downgrades the authentication process and lowers the assurance to, like I said, to no assurance. This takes the FICAN PAX out of operational compliance as it is no longer operating in FICAN mode. When this occurs, it is out of compliance and the operational risk transfers to the agency. However, as I mentioned at the outset, practically speaking, and in context of migrating to a final target state for the FICAM solution, multi-technology cards and readers are often leveraged, in order to perform the transition from existing state to final state. In this context, it is part of a migration strategy and thus often used. The goal is to disable this legacy technology, of course, as soon as possible, thus achieving the final state of compliance and mitigating the risk.
Thank you, Tony. And with that, we are right up on top of our hour. These webinars and these series are available on our website, and there will be after we have closed this. So thank you so much for today. I hope you felt this was worthwhile, and you can access this, I believe, sometime tomorrow or early next week, and they'll stay on there for quite some time. Thank you so much, and have a great day.